My father stood up at the microphone during his own wedding reception, in front of 80 guests, and announced that my childhood bedroom now belonged to his new wife's unborn baby. His new wife filmed my face while she said it. What none of them knew is that I'd spent the last 11 hours pulling a 19-year-old off an operating table with a chest full of shrapnel. I hadn't slept, I hadn't eaten, and I was about to find out that the family who never once visited me at the hospital had already decided where I was allowed to sleep. My name is Dr. Maren Ellison. I'm 33, and 6 weeks earlier I'd been named Lead Trauma Surgeon of the Year at Ashford General, the youngest surgeon in the hospital's history to hold that title. None of that mattered to my father. To him, I was still the daughter who chose work over family. The one who missed birthdays because of emergency surgeries. The one who showed up to holidays in scrubs, smelling like antiseptic, too tired to make conversation. My mother, Diane, had died 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer. I was the one who held her hand in the final hours, because I knew, clinically, exactly what was happening to her body, minute by minute, and I couldn't let her go through it with strangers. My father remarried 14 months later. Her name was Renata. She was 29. The wedding was held at the Copeland Estate, a restored vineyard house, 40 minutes outside the city, 200 people. A string quartet stationed under a canopy of white orchids that must have cost more than my monthly student loan payment. My father in a navy suit he'd never once worn for my mother, not even to her funeral. I arrived straight from a 26-hour shift, still smelling faintly of hospital-grade soap. My badge clipped to my dress because I'd forgotten to take it off in the parking lot. My hands still had that faint chemical tightness they get after hours in surgical gloves. I'd stopped at a gas station to change out of my scrubs in the bathroom, and I'd missed a button on the back of my dress that nobody bothered to tell me about until the ceremony was already half over. If you've ever walked into a room and felt the temperature drop, the second people saw you, you already know what that entrance felt like. An usher I didn't recognize checked a printed seating chart, ran his finger down the list twice, and finally pointed me to a folding table near the kitchen entrance, the one closest to where the servers kept restocking trays of champagne. Not the family table, not even close to it. My father's side of the family, his brother, his golfing friends, 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to since my mother's funeral, sat under the main tent, close enough to hear every toast without straining. Renata's family filled half the tent. My father's side filled the other. My grandmother, Colleen, found me at the folding table. Before the first course was even served, pulled out the chair beside me, without asking, and sat down like she'd planned it that way from the start. She squeezed my hand under the tablecloth. The moment the lights dimmed for the toasts, like she already knew something was coming. The band played through dinner, something upbeat and forgettable, and I watched my father laugh with his golfing friends, 2 tables over, his arms slung across the back of Renata's chair, his wine glass never quite empty. He hadn't looked in my direction once. Not during the ceremony, not during dinner. I'd counted. Halfway through dinner, my father tapped his glass with a fork. The room quieted. "I want to say something," he said, smiling the way. He always smiled when he was about to hurt someone and call it honesty. "Renata's expecting. Due in March." Applause. Someone's champagne glass clinked too hard against another. Then he looked directly at me. "And since we're going to need the space," he said, "Maren's old room is officially the nursery. Maren, you'll need to have your things out by the 15th. 80 faces turned toward me at once. I didn't stand up. I didn't argue. I set my fork down slowly enough that the sound of metal against porcelain was the only noise in the tent for a full second. Renata lifted her phone and pointed it at my face. "We just think it's time," she said, loud enough for the microphone to catch it, "for Maren to build her own life. Somewhere else. Somewhere else. Not my house. Not our house. Somewhere else, like I was a guest who had overstayed a visit I never asked to take." I looked at my father and asked one question. "Are you sure that's the decision you want to make tonight in front of everyone?" He laughed. Actually laughed. The kind of laugh people use when they think they've already won. Loud enough that the 2 tables closest to us laughed along with him, without knowing why, the way people do when they're afraid of being the only one not smiling. "Don't make a scene," he said. waving his fork like the conversation was already over. "You're a doctor, act like one, a doctor." As if the 26 hours I'd just spent holding a stranger's life together in an operating room meant nothing next to the inconvenience of my continued existence in his house. As if steady hands only mattered when they weren't inconvenient to him personally. I didn't answer. I picked my napkin back up, folded it once, and set it beside my plate. Because I already understood something my father hadn't figured out yet. The quietest people in a room are usually the ones keeping score. He had no idea what he'd just done. Arithmetic. Here's something they don't teach you in medical school. How to sit perfectly still while 200 people watch your father erase you. I'd learned it anyway. I sat through the toasts. I sat through the cake cutting. I smiled when Renata's mother told a story about how family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up. While looking directly at Renata and never once at me, I thought about the arithmetic. I had covered 4 of my father's mortgage payments the year after my mother died, when his hours got cut and he was too proud to say he needed help. I never told anyone, not even Colleen. I transferred the money quietly on the 1st of every month, the same way I did everything for that family, because I genuinely believed that's what daughters were supposed to do when nobody else stepped up. I had driven 90 minutes each way, twice a month, for 3 straight years, to sit beside my mother during chemo, holding a plastic basin under her chin at 2 in the morning, while my father couldn't get away from work for a single infusion. Not one. I checked her chart myself every visit because I didn't trust anyone else to catch what I would. I had paid for the headstone granite, her name, the dates, the line from her favorite hymn. Full stop. Nobody offered to split it. I never asked them to because asking would have meant admitting they should have offered in the first place. And in the 6 months since Renata moved in, I had been to that house exactly 4 times. Each time, another piece of my mother had quietly disappeared. Her reading chair replaced with a gray sectional. Her garden, the one she'd spent a decade building, torn out for a stone patio. Her wedding china sold at an estate sale. My father never once mentioned to me that I only found out about because a coworker recognized the pattern on a resale website and sent me a screenshot without a single word of explanation needed. I wasn't losing a bedroom. I was watching the last 4 years of my mother's existence get demolished, room by room, and being handed the bill for standing in the way. If you've ever done the math on what you've given a family that only remembers what you owe them, drop a comment with the word arithmetic. You already know exactly what I'm talking about. My grandmother leaned over during dessert, her voice low enough that only I could hear it under the noise of the band starting up again. "Your mother knew this day was coming," she said, her thumb tracing small circles against the back of my hand. "She told me, 6 years ago, almost to this exact month," she said. "Mom, when Daniel finally does something I can't forgive, I want you to be the one who tells Marin where I put everything." I set my fork down again carefully, the way I set down instruments in the OR when I need a second to think without anyone noticing I'm thinking. "Put what where?" I asked. Colleen didn't answer right away. She glanced once towards my father's table, made sure Renata's phone was pointed somewhere else, and then reached into her handbag. She pulled out a small brass key, worn smooth at the edges from being handled for years, and pressed it into my palm beneath the tablecloth. "Not here," she whispered. "Not tonight. Tonight you're going to go home and you're going to sleep, because tomorrow you're going to need a very clear head, and I have a feeling you haven't had one of those in about 26 hours. She wasn't wrong. I didn't sleep. I drove home in silence, the key sitting in my cup holder like it was radioactive. My hospital badge still clipped crooked to a dress I never wanted to wear again. I thought about every night I'd spent at that hospital, holding someone's life together with my own 2 hands. While 40 minutes away, my family quietly took my mother apart, piece by piece, and called it moving on. If you've ever found out your family had a plan for you that they never bothered to mention until it was already happening, tell me in the comments, because what came next was not the plan my father thought he was writing. My father thought he'd ended an argument that night. He thought he'd delivered a deadline, and I'd quietly comply. The way I'd quietly complied with every mortgage payment, every hospital visit, every bill nobody else wanted to touch. He had no idea. He'd just opened a door he could never close again, because 6 years ago my mother had already known exactly how this story would end. She had spent every single one of those 6 years making sure I'd have the tools to finish it properly, without ever raising my voice once. She just never told me when. Now I knew. The 15th was 11 days away. I had 11 days to find out what that brass key opened, and 11 days to discover exactly how far my father was willing to go, to make sure I never found out at all. The brass key didn't fit anything in my apartment. I tried the mailbox. I tried an old jewelry box of my mother's. I'd kept on my dresser for 4 years. I tried it against every lock in my kitchen drawer at 2 in the morning, still in my wedding reception dress, before I finally gave up and called my grandmother. "It's not a house key," Colleen said, her voice thick with sleep. "It's a safe deposit box. First National, the branch on Doverton. Your mother opened it the same month. She opened the trust. Ask for Renee at the front desk. Tell her you're Diane's daughter. She'll know exactly what to do." I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake doing the math on 11 days, running through everything my father had said at that microphone, over and over, the way I replay a difficult surgical approach before I've even scrubbed in. At 9:02 the next morning, I was standing at the counter of First National, still running on maybe 90 minutes of sleep, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. Renee was maybe 60. Silver hair pulled back tight, reading glasses on a beaded chain. When I said my mother's name, something shifted in her face, quiet and immediate, like she'd been waiting years for someone to finally say it. "Diane Ellison," she repeated. "Of course, come with me." The vault room smelled like cold metal and old paper, a smell I hadn't expected to recognize but did instantly, the same flat mineral smell as the instrument trays before a case. The kind of smell that makes your hands automatically go still and precise without you telling them to. Renee turned her key. I turned mine, and box 214 slid free with a sound like a held breath finally let out. My fingers left a faint smudge of condensation on the metal lid, the kind that happens when your palms are colder than the room, which mine were, even though it was late spring outside. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with age. My name written across the front in my mother's handwriting, the same looping E she used to sign birthday cards. Beneath it, a slim leather ledger, its spine cracked from being opened and closed hundreds of times. Beneath that, a business card for an attorney named Foster Whitlock, and a second, smaller envelope marked simply, "Open this one last, if you've ever opened something your mother left behind and felt her in the room with you. For just a second, you already know what my hands were doing right then. They were not steady anymore." I opened the first envelope in the parking lot, sitting in my car with the engine off, because I didn't trust myself to drive and read at the same time. "Marin," it began. "If you're reading this, it means your grandmother finally decided the time was right, which means your father has finally done something. I hoped he never would. I need you to understand something before you read anything else in this box. I didn't leave you documents because I stopped trusting your father the day I died. I left you documents because I stopped trusting him 3 years before that, when I found out exactly what he'd been doing with the money from my accident settlement." I read that line 4 times. My mother had been in a car accident when I was 26, T-boned by a delivery truck that ran a red light on Route 9. She'd settled with the insurance company for a number I never knew, because my father had handled all the paperwork, the way he handled everything financial in that house, the way I'd never once questioned, because questioning felt disrespectful. The ledger told a different story. The ledger. I want to walk you through this the way I would walk a resident through a chart, because that's the only way I know how to keep my hands from shaking while I explain it. The settlement was $340,000. My mother's handwriting noted the date. It cleared their joint account, and beneath it, in a different pen, added months later, a running list of withdrawals. A boat sold within 2 years that my father claimed had been a family investment. A watch, 2 trips to Cabo that I remembered him posting about, captioned with things like "well-deserved," and "you only live once." While my mother stayed home, recovering from a fractured pelvis that never fully healed. By the time she died, less than half of that settlement remained. My mother had documented every withdrawal she could trace, bank statement by bank statement, in handwriting that got tighter and more controlled. The further into the ledger I read, the same way my own handwriting gets tighter when I'm holding something in, instead of saying it out loud. She hadn't confronted him. She told me why, in the margin, in ink that looked rushed, like she'd added it right before sealing the envelope. I was already sick by the time I understood how bad it was. I didn't have the strength left to fight him and fight the cancer at the same time. So I did the only thing I had energy left for. I protected what was left, and I protected you. If you've ever found out someone you loved was quietly fighting a war you never knew existed, drop the word ledger in the comments. Because that's exactly what this felt like. Finding out my mother had been keeping score long after she stopped having the strength to say anything out loud. I spent the next hour in that parking lot doing what I do best when I don't know how else to cope. I turned grief into a checklist. I photographed every page of the ledger with my phone. I called a friend from residency, Priya, who now worked in the hospital's billing and compliance office and understood financial paper trails better than most attorneys I knew. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked her, hypothetically, how someone would go about verifying 6-year-old bank withdrawals against a settlement disbursement. Subpoena the bank directly if you have to, she said. But if you already have statements, cross-reference the dates against anything public. Property records, DMV registration transfers, social media timestamps. People who hide money badly always leave a second trail without realizing it, because they think the bank statement is the only proof that exists. She was right. My father had posted photos from Cabo both years, geotagged, dated, still sitting on a profile he never bothered to make private. The boat registration transfer showed up in county records 3 weeks after the ledger's matching withdrawal, sold to a neighbor, 2 streets over who I still occasionally saw, walking his dog. None of it had been hidden well. It had just never been looked at by anyone who had a reason to look. What was left of the settlement, roughly $158,000, had been moved into an irrevocable trust 4 months before she died. My name was the sole beneficiary. Foster Whitlock's card sat clipped to the final page, along with a note. He has copies of everything. He also has something I never told your father existed. Go see him before the 15th. Don't wait. I called Whitlock's office from the parking lot. His assistant told me he had a cancellation that same afternoon. I didn't go home to change. I didn't page my chief resident to cover my shift, because for the first time in 11 years of practicing medicine, something had finally outranked a shift on my calendar. Whitlock's office was small, tucked above a dry cleaner, nothing like the glass towers downtown, where my father's own lawyer worked. He was maybe 70. Reading glasses pushed up into thinning white hair, a coffee ring permanently stained into the corner of his desk blotter, 3 cardboard banker's boxes, stacked in the corner with my mother's maiden name, written on the side in faded marker. I've been waiting 6 years for this meeting, he said, before I'd even sat down, before I'd even fully closed the door behind me. Your mother was very specific. She said I wasn't to reach out to you. She said you had to come to me on your own. Because if your father ever found out I'd contacted you first, he'd find a way to make it look like manipulation, like I'd turned you against him, instead of you finding this yourself. He slid a folder across the desk, thick enough that it landed with a small, definite weight. Inside were the original trust documents, the ledger's twin copy, notarized and dated, and something my mother's letter hadn't mentioned at all. A secondary policy, a life insurance rider, she'd taken out on herself 2 years before her diagnosis, naming me as sole beneficiary, structured specifically, so it couldn't be touched, borrowed against, or redirected by anyone but me, not even with power of attorney. My father didn't know it existed. Whitlock was certain of that. He'd handled the paperwork personally, at my mother's insistence, using a separate account she'd opened at a credit union across town, one that never once appeared on any joint statement my father would have thought to check. She paid the premiums out of that account for 6 years straight. Whitlock said, tapping the folder once with 2 fingers. One your father never had access to, never knew the routing number for, never saw a single statement from. I asked her once, gently, why she didn't just leave him while she still had the strength to fight for a fair settlement. she told me leaving would cost her the house. The house she still believed. At the time, she could eventually protect for you outright. She was wrong about protecting it that way. But she wasn't wrong about much else in this file. I sat in that office for almost an hour, going through 6 years of quiet, patient, methodical preparation my mother had built without ever raising her voice, without ever confronting my father, without ever once letting him know she'd stopped trusting him with anything that mattered. She hadn't just protected money, she'd built a case, and she'd built it the way I build a differential diagnosis. Quietly, patiently, ruling out every possibility until only one explanation remained standing. I left Whitlock's office with a folder heavier than anything I'd carried out of that vineyard estate the night before, and for the first time since my father tapped that glass with a fork, I understood exactly why my mother had waited 6 years to let me see it. She hadn't been protecting a secret. She'd been building a timeline. And the 15th wasn't a deadline my father had set. It was one she had. I didn't open the last envelope for 3 days. I told myself it was because I was slammed at the hospital. 2 mass casualty overflow days back to back, 6 hours in the OR on Tuesday alone. A pileup on the interstate that sent 4 patients through my doors within 20 minutes of each other. I remember the exact moment. I peeled off a pair of gloves at 2 a.m., my hands smelling like iodine and adrenaline, my scrub cap sticking to my forehead with sweat. I hadn't noticed, forming in thought, distantly, that the folder sitting on my passenger seat had been there longer than some of my patients had been alive that night. That was true. It just wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I already knew, somewhere under my ribs, that whatever was in that envelope would be the thing that finally made all of this permanent. Once I read it, I couldn't go back to being a daughter who simply didn't have all the information yet. I could still, technically, choose to do nothing. Once I opened it, that choice would disappear. And some small, exhausted part of me wasn't ready to let it go. My phone rang at 6:40 in the morning on day 4, buzzing against the nightstand, hard enough to knock over an empty water glass I'd left there the night before, my father. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit. Then I answered, because 11 years of trauma call had trained something in me that can't ignore a ringing phone before sunrise. Some old reflex that assumes every early call means someone is bleeding. Marin. His voice was warm, easy, the voice he used when he wanted something. The same voice he'd used my entire childhood, right before asking me to cover for him at family functions. He didn't feel like attending. The voice that always sounded like a favor, instead of the order it actually was. Glad I caught you. Renata's doctor moved up her babamoon. They're doing Turks and Caicos next week instead of next month, and I'm slammed at the dealership through the 15th. We need someone to handle the movers when your things come out of your old room. You still have a key. Shouldn't take more than an hour. I sat up in bed, phone pressed against my ear, staring at a water stain on my ceiling. I'd been meaning to get fixed for 8 months, the same shape it had been for 8 months, shaped a little like a state. I couldn't place. You want me to supervise the movers taking my own belongings out of my own childhood bedroom, I said. So you can go to Turks and Caicos. Don't make it weird, he said. You're the responsible one. That's not an insult, Marin. It's a compliment. There it was. If you've ever had someone hand you a chore and call it a compliment in the same breath, you already know exactly the tone I'm describing. I told him I'd think about it, and hung up before he could turn silence into an argument, the way he always did. The way he'd perfected over 30 years of never quite raising his voice, while still somehow making every disagreement my fault by the end of it. The moment I stopped calculating for them. Here's what I want you to understand about that phone call, because it's the moment everything shifted for me, more than the wedding, more than the ledger, more than the trust document sitting in a folder on my passenger seat. For 33 years, I had been doing a version of math without ever calling it math. Every time my father needed something, I calculated the fastest way to provide it without causing friction. Every time my mother needed a ride, a shoulder, a hand to hold, I calculated how to rearrange 26-hour shifts to make it happen, trading with colleagues, sacrificing sleep I never fully got back. I had spent my entire adult life running the numbers on how to be useful enough to earn a place in a family that had already decided, long before that wedding, exactly how much space I was allowed to take up. That phone call was the first time I ran a different calculation. Not how do I make this work for them? What does it cost me to keep doing this? I thought about every mortgage payment, transferred quietly on the first of the month, like a standing order, nobody ever thanked me for. Every chemo appointment, 90 minutes each way, twice a month, holding a basin under my mother's chin at 2 a.m, while my father slept 40 minutes away. I thought about the headstone invoice I paid alone in a funeral home office with faux wood paneling and a box of tissues nobody had refilled, while my father sat in the car, because it was too much for him to walk inside a building he wasn't even required to pay for. I thought about 11 years of surgical training, every all-nighter, every board exam, every single professional milestone, that only ever earned a passing mention at family dinners, before the conversation moved back to something that actually interested them. Renata's nursery colors, my father's new truck, anything at all. That wasn't the daughter quietly holding the family's mortgage payments and medical logistics together with her own 2 hands, using skills nobody at that table had ever once bothered to ask her about in any real detail. I wasn't a daughter to my father. I was infrastructure, load-bearing, reliable, silent, and completely replaceable. The moment something more convenient came along, the way a hospital replaces an aging piece of equipment, the second the newer model arrives and nobody thinks to send the old one a thank you card first, let alone a proper goodbye. If that sentence just made something in your chest go tight, tell me in the comments, because I promise you're not the only one who spent years being someone's infrastructure and calling it love. I called him back that evening. I'll be there, I said, for the movers. Knew I could count on you, he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. Already halfway back to whatever he'd been doing before he called. Already certain the conversation was closed. He had no idea I wasn't agreeing to help him. I was agreeing to be in that house, alone with full legal access to every room, exactly 4 days before the deadline he'd set at his own wedding. Exactly 4 days before the trust documents in Whitlock's folder would become relevant, in a way my father hadn't remotely considered. 20 minutes later, a text came through from Renata. No greeting, no acknowledgement that I'd just agreed to spend my 1 day off that week, hauling boxes out of a room I'd slept in since I was 7 years old. While you're there, can you also grab the crib from the attic? It's the gray one in the corner. Has a sticker on the box. Would save us a trip, thanks, 2 exclamation points. I stared at that text longer than it deserved, because it told me everything I already knew but hadn't said out loud yet. To Renata, I wasn't a woman whose bedroom was being taken from her. I was labor, a resource with a truck-sized SUV, and a flexible enough schedule to be useful on short notice, exactly like the mover I was being asked to supervise, except unpaid, and expected to smile about it. I didn't respond to the text. That night, I finally opened the last envelope. Its inside was a single page, my mother's handwriting steadier here than anywhere else in the ledger. Like she'd written this particular letter on a good day, a clear day, before the disease had taken more than her body, before her hands had started shaking too much to trust with anything but the simplest tasks. Marin, if you're reading this, it means you already have everything you need from Foster. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it, because that was never my job. Even from here, what I will tell you is this. Your father built his entire life on the assumption that you would always absorb the cost of keeping the peace. Every time you did, he learned that lesson a little deeper. You don't owe him one more lesson. You already paid for every single one he's ever gotten from you, in more ways than he will ever understand. When you walk into that house next, walk in as the person who built a career out of staying calm while everything around her is falling apart. That's not a coincidence, sweetheart. I watched you become that person year after year, shift after shift, long before I got sick. Use her. I read it twice, then set it down on my kitchen counter next to a mug of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier, the surface of it filmed over the way it does when nobody remembers to drink it. I thought about the movers. I thought about the 4 days I had left. I thought about a house full of file cabinets, insurance paperwork, and a home office. my father had never once let me into without him standing over my shoulder, watching. The same way he used to check my homework, not to help, but to catch a mistake before I could. Then I opened my laptop and started making a list. The same way I make a list before any procedure. Every step numbered, every contingency accounted for. Because that is the only way I have ever known how to walk into chaos and come out the other side with my hands still steady. Movers arrive at 10. Renata's flight leaves at noon the day before. My father would be at the dealership until at least 6, the way he always was on weekdays. Predictable in that one specific way, even though he'd never once been predictable about anything that mattered to me. That left a window, narrow but real, and I had spent 11 years learning exactly what to do with a narrow, real window. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud, and loud gets dismissed as a scene, exactly the way my father had dismissed me at that reception, in front of 80 people who laughed along without knowing why. What I felt instead was quieter than anger, and far more dangerous, because it didn't need permission to exist, and it didn't need an audience to be real. It was arithmetic. And for the first time in 33 years, I was the only one at that table who actually knew how to do the math. If you think you know where this is going, stay through chapter 4, because you don't, not yet. My father thought he was going on vacation. He had no idea. He was leaving the one person who understood every document in that house completely alone inside it. 4 days before, he expected anyone to know anything, at all, with a set of hands that had spent 11 years learning exactly how to stay calm while everything around them fell apart. The movers arrived at 10, exactly. 2 guys in matching gray shirts, who clearly did this for a living, and had zero interest in the emotional weight of a bedroom, treating my old dresser with the same brisk efficiency they'd give a stranger's couch. I let them start on the furniture, while I went straight for my father's home office, the one room in that house I'd never once been allowed into alone, not even as a teenager, not even to grab a stapler. The door wasn't locked. He'd never imagined he needed to lock it against me. Inside, 3 filing cabinets, a desk with a laptop he'd left charging, a framed photo of him and Renata at some golf tournament, and a small fireproof safe tucked into the closet. The combination taped to the underside of a desk drawer, because my father had never once believed anyone in his life would look hard enough to find it. I didn't need the safe. Whitlock had already told me what mattered was on paper, filed properly, sitting in cabinets. My father assumed no one would ever question, because for 30 years, no one ever had. It took 40 minutes to photograph what I needed, working the way I've trained myself to work in a trauma bay. Methodical, unhurried, one document at a time even when the clock in my head kept ticking. A folder labeled Renovation, Nursery, with an estimate for converting my old room, dated the week before the wedding, which meant he'd been planning this for at least a month before he ever said a word to me. A separate folder tucked behind old tax returns, holding printed emails between my father and an estate attorney. From 8 months earlier, subject line, removing beneficiary restrictions on Diane's trust. He'd tried. Whitlock's irrevocable clause had stopped him cold, and the attorney's final email, curt and professional, told him there was nothing to be done. The trust would activate exactly as written. The moment its trigger condition was met, he'd known. Not the details, not the amount, but he'd known. There was something in that trust designed to stop him, and he'd tried to dismantle it 8 months before he ever stood up at a microphone and gave that trigger condition to me. On a silver platter, in front of 80 witnesses. If you've ever found proof that someone knew exactly what they were doing before they did it, you understand why my hands went very, very still while I photographed that page. I heard the garage door at 1:15, an hour and a half earlier than the at least 6 he'd promised. Tires crunching over the gravel edge of the driveway, the way they always did when he took the turn too fast. By the time he walked into the office, I was sitting in his chair, the folder open on the desk, my phone already back in my pocket, my pulse, the same steady rhythm it holds during a routine appendectomy. "What are you doing in here?" Not a question, a demand, the tone he used on service employees who'd made a mistake he intended to correct in front of a manager, the tone I'd heard him use on waiters, on mechanics. It's on me, more times than I could count. Following up, I said, "On the email you sent Foster's firm 8 months ago, about removing beneficiary restrictions on Mom's trust. His face did something I'd only seen once before, the exact expression he wore. The moment the oncologist told us, my mother's scan had changed from concerning to terminal. All the confidence drained out of it at once, replaced by a kind of blank animal calculation, his jaw working like he was chewing on a sentence he couldn't quite assemble. "That's private correspondence," he said, his voice thinner than it had been a second ago. "It's evidence," I said, "of exactly what Foster warned me you might try. You didn't just spend Mom's settlement money for 6 years. You spent 8 months after her death trying to make sure I'd never see a dollar of what was left." The call that ended. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are picturing a screaming match, and that's not what my mother built me into. I stood up, walked past him, and called Foster Whitlock from the hallway, my voice as level as it is when I'm calling a code. "He's here," I said. "He came home early." "Good," Whitlock said. "Put me on speaker. I've been waiting 6 years to have this conversation with him directly." My father's face when Whitlock's voice filled that hallway was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Whitlock didn't yell either. He simply calmly walked my father through every document in that folder, every withdrawal, every failed attempt to alter the trust, and finished with a sentence that landed harder than anything I could have said myself. "Daniel, the trust activated the moment you publicly announced Marin's removal from the household in front of witnesses. That was your trigger condition. Diane wrote it that way on purpose because she knew you'd never do it quietly. She knew you'd need an audience to feel powerful enough to say it out loud. You gave her exactly what she predicted, on a stage with video evidence, 6 years before it happened. And there is nothing left for you to negotiate, because your own wife already recorded the proof herself." My father sat down on the arm of the office couch like his knees had simply stopped negotiating with the rest of him. If you've ever watched someone realize, in real time, that the trap wasn't set by the person standing in front of them, but by someone who'd been dead for years, drop the word checkmate in the comments, because that's exactly the look on his face. Renata came home 2 days early from Turks and Caicos, still tan, still wearing a wedding ring. She'd had barely 6 weeks. Not for me. For the conversation my father had clearly had with her, the moment he understood what was coming. The one where he had to explain that the house she'd assumed would eventually be theirs had never been his to promise. That the nursery renovation folder in his office now sat inside a legal file with my name on it. That 6 months of planning a future in a house that legally belonged to a trust I controlled had just evaporated in a single afternoon somewhere over the Atlantic, while she was still asking a flight attendant for a second ginger ale. She didn't apologize to me directly. People like Renata rarely do. But she stopped posting. The wedding video she'd filmed of me being humiliated quietly disappeared from her account within a week, the same week. Whitlock's office sent a formal notice regarding the misappropriated settlement funds, copied to a probate attorney who specializes in exactly this kind of family, financial recovery, printed on letterhead, heavy enough that my father actually held it up to the light in the kitchen. Like he thought the paper itself might be some kind of trick. I want to tell you the rest of this ended with a lawsuit. Dramatic and satisfying, gavel and all. But that's not what my mother wanted. And by then, sitting across from Whitlock in his cramped office above the dry cleaner, it wasn't what I wanted either. The choice she left me. Whitlock had one more document for me, the very last one filed separately from everything else, in a plain envelope with no name on it, tucked inside a folder marked only with a date. A letter my mother wrote the same week she signed the trust, meant only for the moment the trust actually activated. Marin, if you're reading this, it means the trust did exactly what I built it to do. I need you to know something before you decide what happens next. You don't have to fight your father for every dollar he took. You don't have to spend years in court proving what you already know is true. I didn't build this so you'd spend your peace chasing him through a courtroom. I built it so you'd never again have to ask permission to exist in a room. Take what's yours. Then go build a life where nobody ever again gets to tell you where you're allowed to sleep. I settled with my father quietly through Whitlock for full repayment of what remained recoverable. enough to close the ledger without opening 5 years of litigation. Neither of us needed, without dragging Colleen through depositions at 81 years old. I didn't move back into that house. I didn't want it anymore. Not the room, not the walls, not the nursery. My father had already priced out before he ever told me I was losing anything. I used part of the settlement to put a down payment on a small house. 11 minutes from the hospital. Close enough to make it to a code in under 6 minutes. Far enough that I never have to drive past the Copeland estate. On my way home, never have to see that white orchid canopy folded up in some rental company's warehouse and think about what it costs to stand under it and be erased. I still keep one thing from my old bedroom. A small brass hook that used to hold my white coat, the one my mother screwed into the wall herself. The week I got into medical school, refusing to let my father hire someone for a 5-minute job. Because, she said, some things a mother should install with her own hands. It's on the wall by my front door now, slightly crooked, exactly the way she left it. Every morning, I hang my keys on it before I leave, for a 12-hour shift, where I hold other people's lives together with the same steady hands. My father once told me to act like a doctor with, in front of 80 people who had no idea what those hands were about to build. He thought he was taking a room away from me that night, standing at a microphone in front of 80 people who laughed along because they were afraid not to. He didn't realize he was handing me the one thing my mother had spent 6 patient, silent years, making sure I'd finally have enough evidence to take back for myself. Not the house, not even the money, just the plain, quiet certainty that I never again have to calculate my worth to anyone who's already decided. I don't have any. Keeping score in a language only I ever needed to understand. If this story hit something in you, if you've ever been treated like infrastructure by people who called it family, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what your own brass key would have opened. Because I promise, you're not the only one in this comment section who's been waiting years to finally read the whole ledger from start to finish.